Just gone 2 minutes past. I think we'll kick off. So first of all, a huge thank you to everyone who's made the time to come along today. I realise we're eating into your lunchtime. So please do feel free to munch away with your camera off. That would be great. And sound off, please, if you're going to do that. This forms part of the program of work that we're doing to consult on the emissions reduction plan and, of course, our response to that. And so this is one of the chapters of that. This one's a little different in the sense that alongside this work, we're doing a deeper piece of work with a small group from within SBC to develop a proposal around agriculture. And Toby and Lorette will talk a bit more about that later on. But just to say that that gives, I suppose, some added impetus to this. So just some quick introductions. Toby Stevenson from SAPRE and his team are online, and Toby will do the introductions later. My colleague Lorette Simonik, who's leading out on this piece of work, and she'll facilitate the Q&A later on. And my other colleague, Kate Wilson-Butler, who's just popped up into my line of sight here. Welcome to them. So today's session, we'll start off with a brief introduction from me, just talking about why it is that we are operating in this space and what we're hoping to get out of the conversation today. I'll then pass across to Toby Stevenson, who'll walk you through a presentation and talk about where we've got to so far in our thinking about this and how that then aligns with the deeper work and proposal that we're working on with a targeted agriculture group. Before he hands across to Lorette, who will facilitate some Q&A, and we'll get a chance to go into it. The thing I will say about this session is, of course, we're building off of the work that we've done previously in the agriculture area. You would have seen in the draft ERP response that went out to you that there was quite a bit of depth in there, and that was really building off previous work that we'd done. What I'd also say is you will get another opportunity to come back and make some comments when we present our penultimate draft. So in a few weeks' time, so actually less than that, 10 days' time, I think, Kate. So keep an eye out for that one as well. I just wanted to make a few opening remarks about why we think, why it is that we've gone into this space and what's important about it. So I suppose the first thing is that, as we know, agriculture-related emissions make up almost half, about 48% of emissions for New Zealand. We're quite unusual in that respect. We look a little bit more like a middle income or developing country in that respect. And to date, we haven't made a lot of progress in terms of being able to flatten that curve. Now, fortunately, we've got a whole lot of processes in place to begin to do that, but we know that it's going to be a big task. One of the things that came up in conversation during the work that we did on the response to the Climate Change Commission's report and after was, is there a role for CLD at a high level to engage in a conversation around setting more ambition for New Zealand in that space? And what would that look like? We were quite conscious as SBC that we are a broad-based organisation and that there are many other sector-specific organisations that are doing particular work in this. So what we didn't want to do was replicate or cut across the work that others were doing. So we were really looking for a space that would be slightly different. What we found in those conversations was that people said, yes, there is room for a role for SBC in two areas. One is to get that kind of cross-sectoral support for saying this is not an agriculture problem, this is a New Zealand problem and challenge, and that actually we need that breadth of support in order to make some of these changes to essentially transition New Zealand to a low emissions future by 2050. And the second was that because we, if you like, aren't in the detail of it, we think we've got an inspiration, an aspirational role here to set out something that perhaps is a little bit out of the box, perhaps a little bit beyond what might be BAU or even a modified form of BAU. I really want to acknowledge the work that Ian and his team have been doing around making sure that what we're doing builds upon the work that is already in train, and that includes the very important work that the Bursa people are doing in terms of their stocktake of agricultural and greenhouse gas research, both this phase in terms of actually doing the stocktake and beyond. And I also want to acknowledge the work that our members have played in having these discussions around what they as companies are already doing or are planning to do. And again, we've made sure that what we do is additional to that and not separate to it. What do we want out of this in the end? We want something that is ambitious, that our members can buy into, both in terms of the investments they will make as individual companies, but also collectively. We want it to be well received by the government, and we are having conversations with MPI and other related government departments around how this would land. And so far, the response to that has been very positive, which is if there was a time to have the conversation about ambition, if there was a time to have conversation particularly about investment in agriculture-related R&D, this is that time. So we feel that actually this will land well. The challenge for us now is to make sure that we get the buy-in of our broader membership, and also that what's in there is sufficiently detailed so people can see what is intended, but not so detailed that we trip ourselves up on the detail and we've got the ambition. And I think that Toby and Ian and the team have done a great job of getting that right balance. So without further ado, Toby, I'm just going to hand across to you to take us through your presentation, and over we go.
Thank you very much, Mike, and hi to everyone there. I see that there's one or two names of organisations that we have already discussed the work that we're doing with, so this might be a little repetitive for you. The work that we're doing on the agricultural R&D is being run in parallel to the work that we're doing for the overall submission, but it is as per the draft that you've seen to create an accelerated pathway for the development and adoption of methane reduction technologies through a public-private initiative to catalyse a transformational shift in investment and leverage international expertise and capital. That's the briefest form of what we're doing. I'm joined by Ian Boddy, Dr. Ian Boddy, who's doing the heavy lifting on the science explanation of the science, the research, and the R&D that would be represented by that. My colleague Karina, who's doing the economics, is not on the call. I'm going to hand over to Ian to take you through the concept of what we're doing. We have presented a draft paper to SPC for their review. But this presentation today steps back a little bit and looks at the concept of what we're trying to achieve. And I'm going to share my screen and hand over to Ian Boddy. Ian?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Toby. And yes, for those on the screen who have already seen this, I apologise, but I can also guarantee that it won't be exactly the same. Okay, so we can see the usual two screens here, Toby.
I'm sorry, I thought I had dealt with that. Apparently not. I'll just deal with that now. Just one moment, please. And there I was. That should be better now.
Okay. So yes, as Toby alluded to, this is sort of going back a step, and this is the fundamental principles of what we're discussing, and it is all about emissions from agriculture. So the terms of reference are as described on the screen, and I'll just whip through those. So we're going to describe the opportunity and the challenges facing New Zealand. I won't probably discuss that in much detail today. Assess the indicative economic case. Similarly, I won't probably discuss that in great detail today, but I will try and explain some of the effort that's gone on to date and in New Zealand and elsewhere, and talk a little bit about the vision and opportunity for New Zealand as to what could be done if there was a significant increase in resource, both financial and expertise, and in terms of infrastructure, and couple that with a sense of urgency. And the aim is to set out a high-level plan for enacting that vision.
So if I could just add to that terms of reference, Ian, what we're wanting to articulate here is additive to what has already been done and the work that BERSA are setting out.
Yes, and I'll try and reference as I can where BERSA, if it is sort of complementary to what we're talking about here today. So today I'm going to talk about an outline of the proposed research program at a high level over both the short and long terms, and the short somewhat relates to the work BERSA is tackling at the moment. Lay out some possible modes of funding by technology development stage. Get your feedback on both of those, which is obviously critically important to us, and also get your views on the R&D gap given the development stages for the various different technologies that exist and which could come to the fore with a concerted effort. So look, I won't bore you with going through the problem in great detail, but we have a very high dependence on ruminant animals. A high percentage of our methane comes from those animals. Our animals are grazed, which is different to a lot of the globe. And so some of the current technologies that are coming out of the rest of the world may not actually be suitable for all farming types here in New Zealand. And in the same context, there are therefore few other groups doing research that are targeting solutions to the enteric methane issue, particularly with an emphasis on grazing animals. So in many ways, it's up to us here in Aotearoa. But at the same time, any New Zealand solution that we might come up with has to be globally accepted, else we're going to suffer various trade issues that might result from that. At the same time, it's worth considering that animal agriculture is under increasing pressure globally. And so we'd like to build that into the context of what we're talking about. And finally, when you're looking to tackle a problem that originates in the rumen, it's useful to understand how the rumen functions to some increased level of scientific understanding. And currently, that's not actually the case. So what I've got here is just a very fundamental discovery and development pipeline, and you've probably seen this in all sorts of different contexts, but if you start from the left-hand end, which is the discovery, this is where you find things. At this point of the pipeline or at the funnel, you get lots of ideas. Most of the work is done in the lab. It's done at a small scale. It's often not done in the target animal or the target species. And so you have a high fail rate. And the work's also largely done in vitro, so it couples with being done in the lab. And as you move through that funnel, there are traditionally go or no-go points, at which point you decide whether a particular technology or idea has merit based on some selection criteria. And you therefore then move through that funnel, looking at things like the intellectual property position, which is important if you want to take something to market. You start to do proof of concept studies. You work in a target species so that you are able to show relevancy to the area that you want to develop your product for. And you work more and more in vivo. So you work more and more in animals. You then work through it into a development phase where you start to look at the safety, the toxicology. You make sure that it makes sense from a financial perspective by considering the cost of goods. And you also look at the mechanism of delivery, and there's a whole plethora of other things that I haven't listed there which do play a role in this funnel. And then finally you get to what can be the most complicated and most heartbreaking aspect of the whole pipeline, which is the regulatory aspect, before finally at the end of it you get a product that you can take to market. So this process can take a significant amount of time, and that's a little bit dependent on what sort of product you're developing. So if we are talking about an animal, a product to be used in animals, then if you are talking about a new chemical compound, so a new to science molecule, then the time from when you actually find a product concept to take forward, it can take between 7 to 10 years to get to market. For a vaccine, it's somewhat reduced. The barriers are less, and so it can take between 3 to 5 years. But if you're working with something which is a far more naturally derived type entity, such as an extract or a natural product, then the time frame can be quite reduced by virtue of the fact that there are less hurdles to overcome, and so the time to get it through the funnel is somewhat reduced. But the fundamental takeaway point is that it is not necessarily a short-term exercise. And so if we have a look at what's available now, and this isn't the be-all and end-all, there are some other things that aren't in there, and this is really the focus of the Bursa work, and there is a report that is near to be finalised that sets these out in more detail. if you start back at the discovery end, and these are things that are concepts, haven't had a lot of work done on them, may not be a lot of investment available to look at them currently. Then we have things like deer and goat genetics, probiotics, which has been considered as an opportunity. The use of New Zealand seaweeds themselves have been looked at. And there are a range of other pieces of technology and intellectual property that sit in various research groups throughout New Zealand that, for one reason or another, haven't been progressed through this particular pipeline. And then as you move through, and I won't go into these in detail, there are things like bromoform, there is the use of lipids, cattle genetics, which is just starting out, and I see Tony's on the call and he's donkey deep in this. There are GM feeds that actually deliver high levels of lipids. And then there is, almost hidden there, is the vaccine work, which I guess is probably the holy grail. There are a range of natural extracts, from garlic extract to cinnamaldehyde-based products. Then there are the seaweeds, which are finding a great deal of favour at the moment. People look on those quite favourably. Sheep genetics, there's been a lot of work done on sheep genetics, and that is now in the point of being rolled out. And then finally, right down the end, and there has been some feedback already that maybe Bovere, which is called 3NOP, which is a molecule that's come out of the Dutch firm DSM, and sits right near the end, and it has actually been registered and is going to be available in the likes of places like Brazil and Chile. But there is no current product on the market that has been through this pathway. And a couple of other points just to make about that particular pipeline. Most of these technologies, other than the vaccine probably, are not necessarily suitable for all species that are farmed in a grazing situation. And that comes about because most of them have to be fed regularly and routinely to elicit their response. And so for many of those technologies, currently they would probably only work in the dairy context in New Zealand. If you take a look across that pipeline, then the short-term focus needs to be either to advance these as rapidly as possible, or to stop investing in them, or to kill them, which is a somewhat more definitive phrase. And the main shortcomings that we've assessed so far is that there is a lack of infrastructure and resources to actually work effectively on all of these opportunities at the same time, which is probably the right thing to do. So that's probably one of the things that has come out of this, and we hope that will be highlighted in the Bursa report, which will be coming out at some point in the future. And so in principle, what we're recommending here is that rather than focusing just on methane, we should go back a step and focus on the overall rumen as a target. And the recognition of this is that the rumen is the source of methane, and so to better understand that would enable a better and more rapid ability to find methane mitigation opportunities. New Zealand is actually probably, well, no, definitely the only group active in pursuing an integrated program of work that looks from the microbes themselves that sit in the rumen right through to a testing and animal program of work. There are other groups that look at doing testing, and there are other groups looking at the rumen, but there are no groups looking at that holistic approach of the whole pipeline. Within New Zealand, as I alluded to before, there is already a large existing IP portfolio that still requires investigation. There are a number of technologies that have been looked at but have been parked because there has been a drive to select the most likely winners, which is the right thing to do when you are pushed for time. But there are still a number of other technologies that could be utilised or could be investigated further that haven't been. There are already several technologies that are being looked at in New Zealand, i.e. the local inhibitor program and the vaccine program, that are currently in development that would require significant more input to fast track them. And what we're saying is that it's fundamentally important to understand the rumen, and it's important for New Zealand on several levels. One is, while the initial problem that we're facing that derives from the rumen is methane, we are always going to be, hopefully, farming ruminant animals, and so understanding the rumen will better position us to be able to identify and come up with solutions to future problems that we may face as we continue to farm animals. And it's important that we take a lead in this, because we also need to ensure access to any intellectual property that is important to New Zealand for use by New Zealand farmers. So our high-level research program outline entails looking at the short-term opportunities that exist now. In many cases, the IP that backs these technologies is already owned by path-to-market partners. So DSM, people who control and operate the Mutrel technology and the seaweed technologies are all out there, but owned by other parties. And we should look to help those parties by making investments that fast-track or drop those technologies more quickly. So again, that comes back to the either make them work or kill them before they become a drain on resources. It's also important that we look to invest to make existing technologies work more broadly across all animal species. So while the dairy industry is a large component of this, it isn't the only game in town, and so ultimately we do need to ensure that there is an opportunity for technologies that work across all animal species that we farm. However, if we look at the long-term opportunities, and this comes back to focusing on the rumen, there is a need to focus on New Zealand-owned IP initially, because we're the only party in town that is focused on this area. And we have a portfolio of IP that warrants further investigation. And we need to invest in order to understand the fundamental issues of rumen function. And in this context, this is about understanding more about the problem. And we should do this in a context that all the findings from that sort of work is open source. It's available to everyone or anyone who wants to have a look at it. And we should just try and facilitate that discovery pipeline. However, there's also a need to solve some of the problems that are facing new technologies, be they existing or be they technologies that are going to come through in the near future. And so these are solving problems that will overcome barriers to enable a plethora of other technologies. So these are more enabling problems. And if we can solve some of those, then that will open the door for a wider range of technologies to be able to take forward. At the same time, there are some technologies where there are specific issues that need to be addressed, and we need to tackle those as well. And so our program is looking at short-term opportunities and long-term opportunities. And within those long-term opportunities, there is a mix of fundamental, applied, and very specifically technology and product focused issues that need to be addressed. So if I delve into those a little bit more, understanding the problem, which is in this case the rumen, to better enable finding solutions. What we're talking about here is getting the smartest minds on the biggest problems. So this goes beyond our internal capability and capacity, and it's trying to attract some of the bigger research groups to tackle some of the problems that we won't be able to tackle ourselves. And the driver behind this isn't always financial. For many research groups around the world, what drives them is the challenge of overcoming particularly challenging intellectual barriers. And so we would look to offer intellectual incentives, opportunities to become the first in the world, opportunities to stake a mark, stake a position as being world leading in a particular area. And as I alluded to before, we would make no claim to IP over this. This would be open source. The next level is, as I described, solving sort of generic problems or investigating new technology opportunities that enable the pipeline to continually be filled. So this involves new lead generation, like incentivizing people to come up with new ways to solve this problem. We will be looking to utilize a global capability, but with existing opportunities that we can provide. We would be looking to incentivize people to find solutions that are targeted to New Zealand issues, but would also have a global context. And in this particular area, we would look to have some limited control over the intellectual property so that we can ensure that New Zealand farmers can have ongoing and long-term access to the outcomes of that research. By buying a solution, I mean aligning a specific problem to a best team approach. We'd be looking to overcome barriers to promising opportunities that are currently sidelined because of a particular barrier. In this context, we would want to own the intellectual property because in owning intellectual property, you have a commercial lever over how it's applied and how it's taken to market. And so I just want to go back and look at that funnel, that discovery to product pipeline, and just try and map what some of the investment opportunities are that fit with that pipeline. So at the left-hand side, more at the discovery end, where the risk is greater and the chance of success is less, then the innovation phase attracts targeted private R&D grants, targeted public R&D grants, where the inherent driver is not necessarily finding a product, but it is it is reducing the risk for a discovery program. And that leads on to the ability to look for contestable grants, both locally and internationally. As you move down that pipeline, then as the risk reduces and the chance of success increases, then the investment type is somewhat led by what the commercialization pathway might be. So usually commercialization would involve either starting up a new company, which would be to either make and sell a product, or alternatively, a licensing mechanism. And if you're talking about a new company formation to make and sell a product, then the investment opportunities are local incubators, VC equity players, green investment funds, both locally and internationally, and the like other investment funds like superannuation funds, etc. Now, these people invest because they're investing for a financial return. And so that means that the pathway to market has to enable those parties to exit and to make a financial return. In a licensing context, the returns are likely to be significantly less because the returns are made solely through royalty returns. And so the investors in that space are somewhat more strategic, or in the context of New Zealand, likely to be our local incubator type entities. But the real big player in the licensing play are likely to be big pharma companies who at times will come right back down the pathway and invest in early stage technologies. And sometimes they will also, big pharma or corporates will also invest in new company development where they want to play a strategic long-term game with the ultimate aim of acquiring or taking on a technology to add to their own portfolio. So the investment opportunities are in some ways aligned to where in that pathway a technology might sit. And the quantum of investment is often driven by the likely return that a partner might make from investing in a technology.
Thank you, Ian.
And that's it. Sorry if I went rather quick, but I've done it a few times now, and so I tend to just assume knowledge.
So it's a fantastic presentation. I just want everyone to understand what is happening now. So that is the sort of high-level nuts and bolts of the proposition. As I said to you, it's being written into a paper which will have a broad appeal and will also include a discussion of the economics. We're currently working at how to articulate just how much emissions reductions could be yielded from following the program, and we don't want to start blurting out numbers before we're very comfortable about how we frame the possibility. But in my mind, what Ian is saying, if we have the option to switch on all of the IP that exists and develop new IP, some of it will come off, some of it won't. But we think that there are substantial material gains, reductions in methane emissions to be had following the program that Ian's at the high level. SPC have also asked us to look to see whether there is a similar upside or downside, if you like, with nitrous oxide. And it's not as big a story as methane, but we certainly think that there's some scope there as well, and we haven't represented that at all today. So thank you for the opportunity for us to at least share the nuts and bolts of what we're doing. There will be more coming, and I'm going to hand back to Mike.
Thanks very much, Toby, and thank you, Ian, for taking us through that very comprehensive presentation. Look, before I hand over to Lorette to take us through the Q&A, I suppose wanted to build on what Toby was saying and bring this down to what we'll be doing over the next few weeks with this information. First thing is to say, sitting in behind what Ian's just spoken to is a very comprehensive report, which we'll be sending out next week once we've finalised that draft of it. It's very detailed, goes into what the opportunities are, what's already underway, things that we can move on quickly, and things that will take more fundamental changes. And it's, I have to say, one of the most exciting things I've seen in this area in the sort of 20 years that I've been working in the space, in the sense that it looks at not just what the opportunities are, but how you realise those things going forward. Next week, we'll be speaking to MPI about that and about how that fits within the work that they're doing with other leadership organisations in the space. What we're trying to do here is to create some sizzle for why it's important to dramatically increase the amount of R&D funding into this area. Just to give you a little bit of a piece on that. Currently, we put around about $27 million per annum into agriculture-related R&D in terms of emissions reductions. There are specific projects over and above that, but that's the kind of the lines that the work that SAPRA has done for us on what goes into it. That is less than the amount of money that New Zealand puts annually into Tonga. Just reflect on that for a second. Our aid program into the Pacific is worth over $500 million. Reflect on that for a second. When we compare that to what we put into R&D as a whole, it comes out at less than 0.05%. That's quite a small number. And when we think about how much we've spent on this week just gone on emergency-related work, that comes to a little bit over 500 million New Zealand dollars. Yep. So we are spending a minute amount on something that is an existential risk to the New Zealand economy, and also a massive upside opportunity. And the report that Toby and Ian and the team are working on really maps that out and makes it clear that it makes no sense at all not to commit significant amounts of sums of money to do this work. Two other points on that. The first is that our understanding is that the government is willing to do so and is looking for opportunities that are of a practical nature, both in the short, the medium, and the long term, to partner with a business to do something in that space. So that's really reassuring. The second is that while we dodged a bullet 2 days ago with the methane pledge from Biden, in the sense that we were able to sign up to it without having to change our approach to methane, we should not be reassured that that will continue. At some stage, the wheel will turn and the focus will go on to agriculture-related methane and other related gases. So we've dodged the bullet this time. I don't think we'll dodge it for much longer, which means that we need to be proactive so that actually we are looking for ways in which we can accelerate emissions reduction in this space. So I think it's a massive opportunity. I think the team have done a great piece of work on pulling this all together. We're really interested in hearing what your thoughts are on it today. I think this will be the centerpiece of our emissions reduction plan submission, because this is where the most work needs to happen and where the most upside sits. So with that, I'm just going to pass across to Lorette to take us through to the next stage. Thanks, Lorette.
No problem. Thank you, Mike, and thanks to Toby and Ian for the presentation. I just wanted to just quickly add on top of that in terms of, yes, whilst the presentation and the points which Mike has been saying particularly have been focused on R&D, and that's the thing, we're also looking more broadly at what other initiatives or policy interventions could be required by the government in order to enable those emissions reductions, particularly within that first budget period and beyond. So thinking beyond R&D, if there are any other suggestions that you have, we would love to hear them. And so with that in mind, I just wanted to sort of open up the floor to any questions or any areas for discussion, comments, observations, or that. So if you could raise your hands or put them in the chat function, that'd be really useful. Thank you.
I think you've blinded them with science.
Yeah, we're just totally confused, everyone. It's one of the two.
If no one's got any questions, there's anyone on the call, and I'm not going to name you, but there's a couple of people on the call, at least three, who have heard this presentation before. Did you want to add anything by way of support for the proposition? You know who you are.
Hi, it's Lee here. Thanks, Toby. I'm sorry I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've been disrupted by children in and out, so I've had to go on mute and run away and deal with kids crying and things. Just to say, I really appreciate the work done by everyone, Toby, Ian, Mike, and the team at SBC. From a Fonterra point of view, this is very much needed. We're well and behind this wholeheartedly. To the point where, one of our executives, Fraser Winter, has joined a few of these calls already previously, and also our chief scientist as well. So thanks, Ian and Toby, for that briefing we had last week or earlier this week. It all seems to be merging into one, living in Auckland, sorry. But yeah, I do agree with the sentiments totally, is that when I was personally shocked when I came 18 months ago to New Zealand from being 20 odd years in Oz, when you look at what countries are doing around the world to tackle their biggest emission source, to see the efforts going on in New Zealand, it was actually quite underwhelming to know that the bottleneck is we've only got 2 chambers for cows for methane, and that's a bottleneck for our research and stuff. And I'll draw the analogy coming from the technology industry. I never would understand why we needed to build big supercomputers as data centers worth $50 to $100 million when I was working for Fujitsu. But when I talked to the research scientists, they said, because it could take 3 weeks to get one computation back, and then I need to go back again and tweak one thing and just press wait. It's like you and I waiting to download an old video 10 years ago will take 15. You can compress the research time, and that's what I'm really excited about, that we can actually test and fail fast and move on to the next thing at a much quicker pace, which is what we need to. And even if we don't solve the whole problem, I think the intangible benefits we get along the way of educating, or some other thing we might sort of discover along the way, could be actually even as much important. I think it's just having a real red hot go at it and demonstrating to our stakeholders who, Fonterra's got activists knocking on our door every day, right? And just to help sort of say, we are taking this seriously, we're all in on this, and it's a collaborative approach, and we're not going to solve it on ourselves, and this is why we need everyone involved, governments, research, industry. And so this is why I'm very excited about this whole initiative. So really appreciate everyone on the call, and look forward to working with you even more on this. Was that what you wanted, Lorette?
Honestly, Lee, that was perfect. Thanks for reading the script out. No, that was great. Yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, and even just because I know that at the moment the information that was produced so far in our ERP draft has been focused more on the methane side, as Toby has referred, that we would be very interested in sort of discussing more that what we could do more in that nitrous oxide space. Yeah, from the R&D perspective, but not necessarily again as well. So looking at what we could sort of unlock more into that space more generally as well.
Great, Dave Willens here from Westpac. Just something, probably an observation I see is it's changes happening across the industry on a number of fronts. So we're seeing stocking rates trend down. We're about to see a huge change in carbon farming, basically, and that's going to remove quite a few animals out of the system. Combine that with research on the rumen development, and then also genetics around low methane genetics. All of them are going to combine to make a reasonable impact put together. But also on top of that, if the industry can increase its R&D investment, that should accelerate it even further.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and it's probably not necessary because I was involved in the earlier conversations about, we've had one with Ian and Toby about nitrous oxide, but there are promising research. There's promising research going on in that space as well that will add to this, and also some immediate policy changes that I think could be made to help fast track mitigation options that we already have. So yeah, I think collectively there's a fair amount that can be done.
Great. Thank you, Alana. Appreciate those words. And then we'll move to Kaylin and then to Kate.
Kia ora, everyone. I was just curious about like part of the presentation I found really interesting is sort of those the amount of time it takes to bring a potential solution online through those regulatory pathways. And I know that was a bit of a conversation in the last submission to Climate Change Commission around government and what they were planning to do to maybe expedite those regulatory pathways, or yeah, I guess act with a bit more haste once we do find some technologies that are deemed viable for the system. I'm just curious, I guess, what the word is on this ERP submission.
Brett, would I be able to speak to that one then?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think at the moment, Kaylin, that what we're trying to do with this, and it's quite intentional, is to position it relative to the COVID response. Is to say that it turns out when something is an emergency and you do need to move quickly on it, you can. And the key to it is putting resource in so that you're able to still run a really good process, which is what has happened with the COVID vaccines, for example, and New Zealand's response to that through its regulatory system. But you can do it at pace as long as you've got resource there, and then you can broaden that up. We're saying to government the same should be true of the other emergency that's going on, which is the climate emergency. And given that this is a massive chunk of our emissions, then surely we also need to accelerate the pace at which the regulatory change can happen around this, because it would be a real bugger if we went and did all this fantastic work only to get it put up in regulatory health. So I think, I say never waste a crisis. That's true, but let's link one crisis to the other and say that just as we needed to be able to move through the process quickly for vaccine regulation, so too do we need to be able to move through the process quickly for some of the things that are here. It's not to say taking any shortcuts, doing it very thoroughly, but doing it at pace because it's urgent.
Thank you, Mike. Was there anything that Toby or Ian wanted to add on top of that?
Just one thing. I mean, it's interesting when you're talking about mitigating methane from a rumen, in that it doesn't actually fit with any existing type of compound. So it isn't a drug because it isn't treating the animal, and it isn't a dietary supplement because it isn't feeding the animal, and it isn't a feed additive because it isn't necessarily enhancing productivity. And so one of the big barriers is that no one's given thought to how you register it, because it's not acting on the animal. So it's considered an animal treatment, but it's actually acting specifically on a bug that sits within a rumen. And so, so the challenges are different, but the point is that it's been known for some time. And so it's quite surprising that there still hasn't been a pathway worked out for it.
Exactly. Thank you, Ian. I'll just pass to Kate and then to you after that, Kate.
Thanks, Lorette. Actually, this was coming back on Dave's comment, which feels now like the conversation's moved on a little bit more. But I was just thinking about Dave coming from Westpac and the role of finance in all of this. And, you know, we've talked before about, yes, we need to see a transformational scale up in public investment. And I think Mike made that point before about how this compares relative to other public investments. But in terms of, you know, private investment and how the sector can show leadership on the finance side, and how we might also leverage finance and investment from offshore as well. I wondered, I don't want to put you on the spot, Dave, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we could frame that up in our ERP submission about the role of finance and how we can support that through financial mechanisms.
Yep, finance sector has quite a big part to play in this. It's an enabler, an educator, a motivator, and when you put financial incentives to an industry or to a business, it generally responds pretty quickly. So I know Westpac's got a very big focus on sustainability and mitigating climate change, and we're rolling that through our agri book over the next 12 months, as a lot of banks are. So I think that will supercharge it when people on the ground are getting signals from central government and also from financiers and all the other businesses they deal with. It's going to speed up that change quite quickly. So, yep, has a big part to play.
Thank you, Dave. And now we'll move to Kat.
Kia ora, everyone. Kat Rowe from Silverfern Farms. Just to, I think, to tautoko what Lee said, so we're right in behind this initiative, and really we've seen the presentation. Ian spoke to us yesterday, so yeah, just to note that we're fully in behind. What I have a query about is just kind of understanding the bureaucratic process that this will go into and how departments prepare their budget bids and that sort of thing. I think we're doing really well to articulate the function of this sort of investment and what that might look like and the sort of things that it would potentially support. I wonder if we need to do more work around the form of it and the architecture, or I guess, are we leaving that to the policy making? And I guess the heart of my question is are we looking at a kind of ara ake type model, or you know, a big multi-pot fund? So I'm just interested to know thoughts around architecture, and is that something we're getting into?
So, Lorette, could I just speak to that for a second and then hand it over to Toby? Yeah, so in the report, we go into quite some detail on this one, Kat. So the answer is yes, we are. So I suppose there's three elements to that. The first is the upcoming funding round, so going into the 2022 budget. So part of the urgency of this, of course, is that it needs to form part of our ERP process so that it goes in at a time when government can respond. So they've indicated to us at very high levels that we're looking very closely at this. So part of what we will do is set out the pieces that would most appropriately go into a 2022 bid. And of course, for this kind of work, that is a 3-year round. So it's actually a 2022 through to 2025 round. So that's significant. The second is that it will form part of the broader ERP architecture of looking forward beyond that to look at what the next 15 years will look like, which of course is what the ERP does. And so that's a way for us to be able to signal long-term needs for investment, which is why we think the ERP process is a good process, because it allows us to flag immediate and medium-term and long-term. And then the final, of course, is that there is discussion around whether or not there might be other funding instruments. And of course, there is the Green Climate Fund, and there's other things like that. But there's talk about other instruments being introduced in 2022, 23 as well. And so we're looking at that as well. So in answer to your question, absolutely. In terms of so that's the funding architecture. If I think about the institutional architecture, you'll see in the report that it goes into some detail on what that might look like. The approach is to look at what is already there and what can be built upon, what needs to be invented, and what needs to be consolidated. So it's looking at all of the different options from a pragmatic point of view of, if we're taking this from a relatively modest sized budget to a large budget, what needs to sit there? And I've been giving the type of Waititi sort of analogy, which is that we're going from him making Boy to him making Thor. So he's going from a modest little budget here in New Zealand to a very large, significant scale project where he needs a whole lot of other international partners. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So how will that scale up work? Which partners do we need to be partnering with, both domestically and internationally? Which bits can be done as they are and just need to grow? Which bits are new? Which bits need to come into some sort of new kind of JV? So we're looking at all of those different elements, and those will phase out over the next few months. Toby, over to you.
Oh, thanks,
Thanks,
Mike. Kat, we talk about the existing arrangements, and as Mike has said, and in the one-on-ones we have had some discussions about the way greater funding could be dispersed. What we don't want to do is we don't want to advocate a governance model and an institutional arrangement and trigger a scrap over that. We want the discussion and to be about turbocharging the effort, making sure that whatever we do is respectful and consistent with the existing institutional arrangements, but not foreclosing or foreshadowing what the final institutional form is. And we haven't had a brief yet to tease that out more, and I'm hoping not to go into that, whether it's a contestable fund or just exactly how it would be, because that discussion, the fighting over how that might be and who might control it, could distract from the meta picture.
Great. Thanks, Toby, and thanks to Mike. Can we please now move to Alana, who I see has got her hand up there. Alana. Oh, Alana's gone. No problem at all. Kat, did that answer exactly what you had in mind in terms of your response, or did anything pick up before we move to Tony?
No, really helpful. Thanks. I think there's a little bit of our view is there's been a real lack of imagination by policymakers in this space, and I think the scant amount of information released in the discussion document reflects that. So I guess it's just how much do we have to provide the final model, or will that work be able to be done at pace by the relevant ministries? I think that's the trade-off, isn't it?
I think you already know the answer to that question, and so which is why we put this leadership group together.
Yeah.
Which is a recognition that for close to 30 years, New Zealand hasn't really shown scale ambition here.
Yeah, I guess our interest is we want this to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah,
and I think everyone on this call probably shares that.
Totally, and which is why that ag group is really critical, because that's what's providing the momentum and energy, frankly, to make this happen.
Yeah, thank you. It's great work from all involved.
Awesome, thank you. And now I see that let's start with Alana. So I've got it, Alana, and then I'll go to you, Tony. Alana?
Yeah, sorry about that Zoom error.
No worries at all.
This is going back a bit, but I did just want to go back to Dave's point about financial mechanisms. And this is not an area that we're heavily involved in, but I wondered if you could elaborate any more on what they might look like, because we're now, it's quite a busy space. On top of the SAFI initiative, there's a bunch of sectoral initiatives, and I just wondered whether there should be any further discussion of how to simplify that space, or any comment on how that will drive change.
Lana, that is brought up in the document.
Okay.
And so when that goes out, I think you'll see next week that there's a good piece on how that might work. But to Toby's point, what we don't want to do is get caught up in that kind of detailed warfare that sometimes comes in when people are feel threatened. So instead of doing that, we're opening it up to say, this is what needs to happen. Here's some thoughts for how you might want to make it happen, and then allowing that to organically happen. But you'll see there's quite a bit of detail on the report on that one.
Ian has to go at 1 o'clock, and I imagine others do as well.
Great. We'll just pop over to Tony really quick just to ask his, and then if we can't answer that, we'll come back to you, Tony. But yeah, just mindful of that.
Yep, cool. So obviously I've been involved in support all of the emphasis on the R&D work, but just wanted to shift the topic a little bit in that a lot of the discussion questions that were raised were around how do we actually support change and encourage uptake on farm and things like that, and there's no real discussion around that. There's also questions relating to how do we communicate how good we are being, what change we're getting on farm through to international customers. So I know we reference He Waka Eke Noa, and that things will be coming out of that, and some of those, particularly around the on-farm change side of things, will be more addressed through those processes. But just wondering what others' views might be, whether we need to have a little bit more direction or guidance on those particular questions.
Great call, Tony. It's Lee. Fully support that. And I think it was a conference earlier this year where we saw the Irish put out their agriculture net zero roadmap, and we've kind of got something similar, but we haven't got I don't know, the courage or the or that to put something like that out there on behalf of New Zealand, which I think is needed, and some leadership from the top, not just from individuals. I think as a collective it'd be really good to help with that change. Even on the farmer on change is probably our biggest challenge, and a really good communication tool we've used is a net zero roadmap from Nestle as to why farmers need to change. And I think that coming from a consistent roadmap from government planning it out years in advance would be really good. Not just sort of what we're seeing last week, this week, catching everyone off guard, a methodical, planned out thing where we can bring them along, and He Waka Eke Noa to us is kind of like a black box that might be something lobbed over the fence. So we kind of really change that dynamic, I think, and then ongoing communication and long-term change management. It's something we're looking at internally as well, for sure.
Would you like me to close out?
Sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. We've got 1 minute too, so we've got no more time for any further questions anyway. So yes, that sounds great.
Great. Thanks, Lorette. Hey, thank you for everyone for coming on. I know you'll all be dropping off now. Just very quickly, if there are any things you want to follow up with, please do get hold of Lorette, Kate, or myself, and obviously we'll get hold of the team. Second piece would be on that broader question that was just raised now by Tony. We are aware that this conversation is very R&D focused. So if there are things that you want to talk more broadly about, please let us know. We'd love to build on that, particularly those comments that Tony and Lee made near the end there. And finally, I suppose just a general question on process. We will circle back again with our final version. So next two final versions. So do get involved in that. All the way through this, though, and I know that those of you who've been involved before will know this, please get a hold of us if you have any concerns. We don't want you to be holding concerns. We want to be able to address them as we go through. We want this to be nice and ambitious, but we also want you to be sitting in behind it. So please do get in contact with us. Thank you for everybody for today, and that's us signing off.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Lorette.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.